There is a specific kind of hum that fills the air in DeKalb County, Illinois, during the month of April. It is not the sound of nature waking up, but the roar of heavy iron. In the heart of the Corn Belt, where the soil is so dark and rich it looks like chocolate cake, the spring of 1982 felt like the dawn of a new empire. For decades, the mantra of the American farmer had been simple: work hard, pay your debts, and trust the land. But by the early 1980s, that old song had been replaced by a new, aggressive anthem. The high flyers in Washington and the bankers in Chicago were shouting a four-word command that echoed through every feed store and grain elevator from Ohio to Nebraska: get big or get out. To understand what Samuel Miller did, you have to understand the intoxicating fever that had gripped the Midwest for the previous 10 years. In the 1970s, the world was hungry, export markets were booming, and grain prices had touched the stars. Land that was worth $400 an acre in 1970 had skyrocketed to over $2,000 by 1980. It was a gold rush in overalls. Banks were practically shoving money into farmers' pockets, encouraging them to leverage every acre they owned to buy bigger tractors, more chemicals, and more land. If you weren't driving a brand new four-wheel drive machine with an air-conditioned cab, people looked at you like you were standing still in a race that had already started. Samuel Miller was 48 years old that spring, a man who moved with a deliberate, quiet grace that he had learned as a young Marine in the Pacific. He farmed 320 acres of the best ground in the county, ground his family had held since before the Civil War. While his neighbors were busy signing papers for $200,000 loans to install center pivot irrigation and buying the latest 12-row planters, Samuel was doing something that made the folks at the DeKalb County Bank whisper behind his back. On a Tuesday morning in early April, Samuel walked into the local John Deere dealership. The owner, a man named Marcus Thorne, greeted him with the wide, hungry smile of a man who expected to sell $500,000 worth of equipment by noon. Marcus had a shiny new 4440 sitting on the lot, a mechanical beast that represented the pinnacle of 1980s technology. He assumed Samuel was there to trade in his older equipment and join the modern age. "Good morning, Sam," Marcus said, slapping the hood of a tractor. "She's a beauty, isn't she? I've got the paperwork ready for that upgrade we talked about. With the new government subsidies and the way corn is looking, this machine will pay for itself in 3 seasons. We can spread the payments out over 7 years at a low rate." Samuel looked at the machine, then at the rows of massive equipment filling the lot. He didn't see progress. He saw a trap. He had watched the interest rates beginning to creep up, and he remembered the stories his father told him about the Great Depression, how the men who owed the most were the first ones to lose the dirt under their fingernails. "I'm not here to buy, Marcus," Samuel said quietly. "I'm here to sell. I want you to take back the tractor I bought last year. I'm going back to my old 4020, and I'm canceling the order for the new sprayer." The dealership went silent. The smile on Marcus's face didn't just fade, it collapsed. "You're joking. Sam, you've got 320 acres of prime Illinois black gold. You can't farm that with 20-year-old iron. You'll be left in the dust. Everyone is expanding. If you don't keep up, you're just a backward man." "Maybe so," Samuel replied, unbothered. "But I'd rather be a backward man who owns his land than a modern man who belongs to the bank." The news of Samuel Miller's retreat spread through the county like a prairie fire. At the local diner, where the coffee was strong and the talk was mostly about the price of anhydrous ammonia, the mockery was relentless. They called him Old School Sam and the backward man. They laughed when they heard he had turned down a $200,000 expansion loan, a sum that most farmers at the time viewed as a ticket to the big leagues. "Did you hear about Miller?" one farmer asked, shaking his head over a plate of eggs. "He's selling off his new equipment, says he's going to plant alfalfa and barley alongside his Ngoro." "Alfalfa? In DeKalb County? That's like trying to sell ice to an Eskimo. We're the corn capital of the world. Why would anyone grow cow feed on $3,000 an acre ground?" Another man chimed in. "He's even talking about letting his cattle roam on the stubble instead of keeping them in a finishing lot." The man's lost his mind. "He's taking us back to the 1930s. We've got men on the moon, and Samuel Miller is worried about crop rotation." But Samuel wasn't listening to the laughter. He was watching the horizon. He had spent the last few months in his workshop, sitting at an old wooden desk that had belonged to his father. On that desk sat a small, leather-bound notebook, with pages so thin they felt like onion skin. It was his father's journal from the 1930s, the years of the Dust Bowl, when the sky over Illinois had turned black with the topsoil of Kansas and Oklahoma. His father, Thomas Miller, had survived those years when others had packed their bags for California. He hadn't survived by getting bigger, he had survived by being smarter than the weather. As Samuel turned the faded pages, he found a passage underlined in thick, black ink. The land is not a machine you can switch on and off with a checkbook. It is a living body. If you bleed it dry with chemicals and push it too hard with steel, it will fail you just when you need it most. Respect the diversity of the soil, or the wind will take your future. While his neighbors were ripping out the old hedgerows and shelter belts to squeeze every last inch of space for corn, Samuel was doing the opposite. He was planting rows of clover and vetch. He was refusing to use the heavy doses of synthetic nitrogen that the university experts insisted were necessary for a real yield. To the experts, the soil was just a medium to hold up the plant, while the chemicals did the work. To Samuel, the soil was the work. By the end of April 1982, Samuel Miller had become a pariah in his own community. He was the man who refused to move forward, the man who turned his back on the great American expansion. As he sat on his old tractor, pulling a simple grain drill through the black Illinois dirt, he could see his neighbors on the other side of the fence, driving their massive, air-conditioned machines, waving at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. They were planting for the market of today. Samuel was planting for a storm that hadn't arrived yet. He knew that the music was going to stop eventually. He just didn't realize how loud the silence would be when it finally did. To understand why Samuel Miller was willing to let the world laugh at him, you have to look at the shadow of the man who came before him. Thomas Miller had been a farmer in the black dirt country of Illinois since he survived the land rush, the First World War, and the boom times of the 1920s. He was a man who had seen the sky turn to iron and the earth turn to ash during the 1930s, an apocalyptic era where drought and poor farming practices combined to create the worst environmental disaster in American history. Thomas had watched the topsoil, that precious, thin layer of earth that makes human life possible, simply blow away, leaving behind nothing but hard pan and despair. He had seen his neighbors, families who had been there for generations, pack their cars and head for California because they had nothing left but dust. Thomas Miller stayed, and he survived because he stopped treating the land like a factory and started treating it like a living body. Before he died in 1978, he left Samuel a leather-bound journal wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the moisture. It wasn't a diary of his life or his family. It was a record of 50 years of sweat, tears, and lessons paid for in failure. The journal ended with a warning that Samuel read every single night. The drought will come again. It always does. Wheat and corn die in the dry years, but the deep-rooted things survive. Plant for the drought before it comes, not after. After is too late. In the spring of 1982, as Samuel sat in his workshop, he wasn't looking at the glossy brochures for chemical fertilizers that promised 200 bushel yields. He was looking at his father's sketches of root systems. He realized that the modern way of farming was essentially mining the soil rather than building it. His neighbors were using high-octane synthetic nitrogen to force the corn to grow fast, but that nitrogen made the plants lazy. Their roots stayed shallow, hovering near the surface where the chemicals were easy to reach. Samuel knew that if the rain ever stopped, those shallow-rooted plants would be the first to die. So, Samuel began his retreat into the past. He sold the heavy machinery because he understood a lesson his father had learned in the mountains of Italy during the war. The man with the longest supply line is the man who loses. A tractor that requires expensive parts from Indiana and diesel from the Middle East has a supply line thousands of miles long, but a farm that generates its own fertility and uses its own resources is independent. Samuel decided to plant alfalfa and barley in rotation with his Engoro. Alfalfa was a legume, and Samuel knew the science that his neighbors had forgotten or ignored. Legumes have a symbiotic relationship with bacteria that pulls nitrogen gas directly from the atmosphere and converts it into a form the plants can use for free. A good stand of alfalfa could fix over 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year, providing the equivalent of $60 worth of anhydrous ammonia without Samuel ever having to write a check to the chemical company. But it wasn't just about the nitrogen. The roots of the alfalfa went deep, far deeper than corn or wheat roots. They broke through the heavy clay subsoil, creating tiny highways for water and air to penetrate the ground. When those roots eventually died and decayed, they fed the soil biology, the earthworms, the fungi, and the microscopic life that makes soil truly alive. Samuel was building a biological sponge that could hold moisture, while his neighbors were turning their fields into a hard, chemical-dependent shelf. By May of 1982, Samuel began his most controversial practice. He started fencing off sections of his corn ground to allow a small herd of cattle to graze on the cover crops. In DeKalb County, where every square inch of land was expected to produce a cash crop, seeing cattle wasting good corn ground was considered a sin. But Samuel watched the cattle with a quiet smile. He knew they were doing work no machine could replicate. They ate the grass and clover, deposited natural manure, and their hooves pressed seeds into the dirt, creating microsites for germination. It was a cycle of life that had fed the prairie for 10,000 years before the first plow ever broke the sod. The mockery from the town didn't stop at the diner. One afternoon, a young, sharp-dressed agricultural expert from the state university named Dr. Holloway drove out to the Miller farm. He had heard rumors of a farmer in DeKalb County who was reverting to medieval practices and wanted to see the disaster for himself. He found Samuel standing in a field of waist-high alfalfa and barley with a notebook in his hand. "Samuel," the professor said, gesturing toward the diverse green tangle of the field, "I've seen your soil maps. You have Class 1 prairie loam here. This ground is capable of producing record-breaking corn yields if you just apply the proper chemical inputs. Instead, you're growing what looks like a weed patch. Do you realize you're throwing away thousands of dollars in potential profit?" Samuel looked at the young man, whose shoes were already getting dusty. "I'm not throwing it away, doctor. I'm putting it in the bank. It's just a different kind of bank." "You're talking about soil health," Holloway said with a patronizing sigh. "That's all well and good for a garden, but this is industrial agriculture. We have tractors now. We have center pivots and herbicides. We don't need to go back to the Stone Age to solve our problems. You're mining the past, Samuel, while the rest of the world is building the future." "I see it a bit differently," Samuel replied calmly. "You're the one mining. You're taking everything the land has to give and replacing it with something that comes in a jug. My father watched this county turn to dust in the 30s because men thought they were smarter than the wind. He wrote down what he learned, so I wouldn't have to pay for those mistakes again. I'm not mining the past. I'm listening to it." The professor shook his head and made a note in his clipboard, likely labeling Samuel as a backward man who couldn't be helped. He drove away, convinced that the Miller farm would be the first one to go under when the next market shift happened. Samuel didn't argue. He just went back to his notebook. He recorded the earthworm counts in his soil, which had already begun to rise from 3 per square foot to over 12 in just one season. He noted the way the soil felt in his hands, cool, moist, and smelling of rich life, even on the hottest days of July. He was preparing for a possibility that no one else wanted to believe in. He was building a fortress of biology, 1 acre at a time, while the rest of the county was building a mountain of debt. By the end of that first year, Samuel's profit margins were razor-thin. His neighbors, who had harvested massive amounts of corn using every chemical available, were flush with cash from the high prices of the early 80s. They bought more land. They bought bigger trucks. They laughed at the backward man who was spending his time counting worms and planting cow feed. But Samuel remembered the final entry in his father's journal. It said that the crowd is almost never right when the weather changes. It said that the man who survives is the one who controls his own supplies and his own fate. So, Samuel Miller stayed the course. He kept his old tractor, he kept his notebook, and he kept his debt at zero. He was waiting for the moment when the supply line would finally break. By the spring of 1983, the nickname "the Backward Man" was no longer just a passing joke in DeKalb County. It had become a permanent label for Samuel Miller. At the local diner, where farmers gathered to grumble about the rising price of synthetic nitrogen and the cost of anhydrous ammonia, Samuel's arrival was always met with a chorus of smirks. Marcus Thorne, the John Deere dealer, remained the loudest voice of criticism. He would often point out the window when Samuel's old, battered pickup drove past and tell the crowd, "There goes Sam, driving toward the 19th century while the rest of us are breaking speed records into the 21st. Everyone in the county could recognize the Miller farm from miles away, but not because of its modern efficiency. While the neighbors' fields were scrubbed clean of every stray leaf or weed by heavy doses of pre-emergent herbicides, Samuel's ground looked like a chaotic tangle. He hadn't ripped out the old hedgerows or shelter belts to squeeze in more rows of corn. Instead, he allowed them to grow thick as a refuge for birds and beneficial insects. He didn't moldboard plow his soil into a smooth, black mirror that would bake in the sun. He left the stalks and residues from the previous year's barley and clover to carpet the earth. To the farmers who viewed a clean field as the ultimate badge of success, Samuel's land looked like a neglected mess. Samuel had even begun to implement the ancient technique of companion planting that he had rediscovered in his father's journal and old agricultural texts. He was planting strips of alfalfa and barley directly alongside his corn, a practice the neighbors called double trouble. Sam, a neighbor named Roy Dennison, said as he leaned against the fence post, "You're making it impossible for yourself. Your combine is going to choke on that matted green mess. 2 crops in one field is just 2 ways to fail at once." Samuel just smiled, wiped the red Illinois dust from his forehead, and replied that if nature never planted a monoculture on the prairie, perhaps man wasn't meant to either. The mockery, however, didn't stay confined to the fence rows or the grain elevators. It began to seep into Samuel's own home. His teenage son, Thomas, would often come home from school with a slumped shoulders and a dark cloud on his face. He had been teased by the other boys whose fathers were buying massive 4-wheel drive tractors and expanding their operations by hundreds of acres. They told him his father was a backward farmer who didn't know how the world worked anymore. One evening, after Thomas had been particularly quiet during supper, Samuel sat him down at the kitchen table and opened the leather-bound notebook that had belonged to Thomas's grandfather. He pointed to the entries from 1935, the years when the sky turned black with dust. "The crowd almost always runs toward the things that shine the brightest," Samuel said softly, his eyes reflecting the yellow light of the kitchen lamp. "But real wisdom usually lies in the things they've thrown away." He explained to his son that while the neighbors were mortgaging their futures to buy more iron and chemicals, they were building a biological bank account right under their boots. Every acre of alfalfa Samuel planted was doing more than just growing hay. Its roots were silently pulling nitrogen from the atmosphere and fixing it into the soil, providing thousands of dollars worth of free fertility that wouldn't require a single check written to the chemical dealer. While the neighbors were struggling under the weight of 18% interest on their short-term operating loans, Samuel didn't owe a dime to the bank. He was willing to accept slightly lower yields in the short term to ensure absolute independence for the long haul. "We aren't mining this dirt, son," Samuel told him. "We're feeding it so it can feed us when the music stops." 1983 proved to be a year that tested the limits of everyone's patience. Another agricultural specialist from the university visited the Miller farm, looking at the corn matted with clover and shaking his head in disbelief. "Samuel, you're turning prime Class 1 loam into a medieval pasture," the specialist sneered. "Do you realize that with a standard chemical regimen, you could boost your bushel count by 40%? Samuel simply reached down, dug a handful of tilled earth, and showed the man the dark, crumbly soil teeming with earthworms. "My soil is coming back to life," Samuel said firmly. "Yours is just a shelf for chemicals to sit on. I'm prepared to wait." Outside the boundaries of the Miller farm, the first fissures of a massive collapse were beginning to show. Interest rates refused to drop, and the prices for corn and soybeans began to wobble as the export markets tightened. Farmers who had leveraged millions of dollars to get big were finding that no matter how massive their tractors were, they couldn't outrun the math of a disappearing profit margin. Samuel remained steady on his 20-year-old tractor, no air conditioning, no stereo, just the sound of the wind and the chatter of birds in the very hedgerows he had refused to bulldoze. He noticed that his soil held onto moisture much longer after a spring rain, and the fierce Illinois winds couldn't kick up a dust plume from his fields because the root systems held the earth in a tight grip. He had finished building his biological fortress. The crowd was still laughing at the diner, but Samuel Miller knew that their season of mockery was drawing to a close. A different kind of storm was approaching, an economic and climatic reckoning that would separate those who understood the land from those who merely treated it as a machine. In the long history of the American Midwest, there are years that are remembered for their bounty, and then there are years that are remembered for the way they broke a man's spirit. 1984 was the latter. It was the year the music finally stopped for the Great Expansion, and the silence that followed was deafening. To understand the reckoning that hit DeKalb County, you have to look at the two-headed monster that arrived at the doorstep of every farm: the economic collapse and the worst drought in half a century. The economic storm had been building since Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker raised interest rates to combat inflation. By 1984, the prime rate had touched heights that seemed impossible only a few years earlier, and farm operating loans that were once a manageable 9% had doubled to 18% or more. At the same time, the grain embargo and a sudden surplus of grain caused the export markets to collapse. Corn prices, which farmers had banked on staying high to pay for their massive debts, plummeted toward $2.22 a bushel. For Samuel Miller's neighbors, the math was no longer working. They had borrowed against land that was now dropping in value by hundreds of dollars an acre every year. They were paying 18% interest on machines that were sitting idle because they couldn't afford the diesel to run them. The banks, which had been so friendly 3 years earlier, were now issuing acceleration notices and demanding full repayment of loans. The first wave of foreclosures began, and the proud, shiny green tractors that Marcus Thorne had sold with such fanfare were being loaded onto trailers and repossessed. Then, the weather turned. The spring of 1984 was dry, but the summer was a furnace. By June, the county was in the grip of a brutal drought. July brought day after day of 100-degree heat and cloudless skies. In the modern fields of Samuel's neighbors, the corn began to scream. Because these plants had been fed a steady diet of synthetic nitrogen, they had never been forced to grow deep roots. They were lazy, shallow, rooted plants that relied on the top few inches of soil for everything. As the sun baked that topsoil into a hard, cracked shelf, those roots found nothing. By noon every day, the leaves of the neighbor's corn would roll up tight to protect themselves from the heat, a desperate sign of water stress. But on the Miller farm, something different was happening. Samuel's field, which had been mocked as a weed patch, remained stubbornly green. While the neighbor's corn withered and turned brown and brittle, Samuel's crop stood tall. The reason wasn't luck, it was biology. For 3 years, the clover and alfalfa Samuel had planted had been doing the biological work that no machine could do. Their deep roots had shattered the clay subsoil, creating a biological sponge that absorbed every drop of spring rain and held it deep underground. While the surface was dry as a bone, Samuel's soil was cool and moist 6 inches down. Furthermore, the organic matter Samuel had built up acted as a reservoir. His soil aggregate stability meant the ground didn't crust over, it breathed. The mycorrhizal fungi in his root zones were reaching into depths the neighbor's chemical-dependent crops could never access, delivering water and nutrients to the stalks. The contrast was so sharp it was haunting. On one side of the fence, the modern world was dying in a cloud of dust. On the other side, the backward man was walking through rows of thriving corn that showed no sign of the heat. The mockery at the diner had stopped. It was replaced by a grim, hollow-eyed silence. Men who had laughed at old-school Sam were now watching their family legacies disappear in a single season. The suicide rate among farmers was rising toward 3 times the national average as the pressure of debt and failure became too much to bear. In August, Roy Dennison, the neighbor who had once said Samuel's farm looked like a disaster, drove his old pickup to the edge of Samuel's field. He didn't get out. He just sat there for an hour, looking at the green corn and the dark, moist soil under the clover residue. He was watching a man who had no debt, no fuel costs for heavy tillage, and no fertilizer bills. Samuel had bought the dead ground of the past and turned it into the only productive land in the county. Samuel walked over to the truck. He didn't gloat. He didn't say, "I told you so." He had too much respect for his neighbor's pain for that. "How's it looking, Roy?" Samuel asked quietly. Roy didn't look at him. His voice was thick with the weight of a world collapsing. "It's gone, Sam. The bank called yesterday. They're taking the North Quarter next month. Everything I planted. It's just stubble." "How is yours still alive?" Samuel leaned against the truck door. "My father always told me that the ground isn't the problem, Roy. The debt is. And the chemicals. They made the corn forget how to be a plant. They made it forget how to go deep." Roy finally looked at him, tears in his eyes. "We all thought you were the fool. We thought you were scared of progress. Turns out you were the only one who knew what he was doing." "I just listened to the man who came before me," Samuel replied. "He paid for this knowledge in the 30s, so I wouldn't have to pay for it now. I'm sorry it had to happen this way, Roy. Truly." By the end of the harvest season in 1984, the numbers were in. The county average for corn was a dismal failure, with many fields yielding nothing at all. Samuel Miller's backward farm, however, yielded over 130 bushels per acre. Because his costs were essentially zero compared to the heavy input farms, his net profit per acre was nearly 3 times the county average. While the grain elevators were half empty and the local bankers were pale with fear, Samuel Miller was the only farmer in DeKalb County with money in his pocket and a future that belonged to him. He had prepared for the possibility that the supply line would break, and when it did, he was the only one still standing. The backward man had become the richest farmer in the county, not in the number of shiny tractors he owned, but in the depth of his soil and the independence of his spirit. The reckoning had arrived, and the land had chosen its survivor. The aftermath of 1984 left a permanent scar on the landscape of DeKalb County, but on the 320 acres belonging to Samuel Miller, it marked the beginning of a quiet revolution. By 1985, the mockery had completely vanished, replaced by a profound and heavy respect. Samuel had become more than just a survivor. He was the largest and most successful farmer in the county, yet he remained the most humble. While the grain elevators in town were often half empty, and the local dealerships continued to struggle, Samuel's barn was a hive of activity. He didn't spend his money on flashy new iron or the latest chemical breakthroughs. Instead, he quietly began to use his profits to buy back the land that the banks had seized from his neighbors. By 1986, Samuel owned 800 acres, including the old Watkins place and the Mitchell brothers' land. He didn't want to be the kind of man who profited from the despair of his friends, so he often paid fair prices, more than the banks were asking at auction, to ensure the land stayed productive and cared for. He was no longer called the backward man or double trouble. The community now referred to him as a teacher. Starting in the late 1980s, farmers from 3 states started coming to his kitchen table and his equipment sheds. They came not to mock, but to see how he had modified his planters and to ask for copies of the key pages from his father's leather-bound journal. Samuel taught them that the land wasn't a machine, but a living body that required diversity to stay healthy. He showed them the earthworm counts in his soil, which had risen to 22 per cubic foot levels that surpassed even the most expensive Class 1 ground in the state. He showed them how the creek running along the south edge of his property was now running clear, even after a heavy rain, because his deep-rooted clover and alfalfa were holding the topsoil in place. He shared the wisdom that had been paid for in the sweat and tears of the 1930s, explaining that the drought will come again and that the secret was to plant for the disaster before it arrived, not after. "Why didn't you tell us this back in '76? One farmer asked during a particularly dry summer in the early 90s. Samuel sighed, a weary but kind look in his eyes. "Would you have listened back then? People don't listen to warnings. They don't believe a crisis can happen until it's already at their door. My father knew that. That's why he told me to plant the wrong crop when everyone else was chasing gold. After the drought starts is always too late." As the years passed, the Miller farm became a living laboratory for what the university experts eventually started calling regenerative agriculture or sustainable farming. Samuel didn't care much for the fancy names. To him, it was just common sense and respect for the people who came before him. By 1992, the local historical society even asked to display his father's journal in their museum, but Samuel refused to let it go just yet. He had one more chapter to add to it himself. He wrote about the 1980s, about the backward man who was proven right, and about how he had built his organic matter from 1.2% to over 5%, returning the ground to the state of the original virgin prairie. On a crisp October afternoon in 1998, Samuel stood on the highest ridge of his 800 acres with his 10-year-old grandson, Michael. Samuel was 74 years old now, his hands gnarled like the roots of the old oak trees he had protected along his fence lines. Below them, the valley was a patchwork of deep green and gold. The air was filled with the sound of the wind, that relentless Illinois current that had once stolen the future of so many families. But on the Miller land, the wind met a wall of biological resistance, hedgerows, stone windbreaks, and thick, living soil that refused to blow away. Samuel pulled the old leather-bound notebook from his jacket pocket and handed it to the boy. It was thin, the edges frayed and the pages yellowed with time, but to Samuel, it was the most valuable thing on the farm. "Michael," the old man said, his voice as steady as the earth beneath them, "I'm handing you the keys to this land, but they aren't made of brass or steel. They're in these pages. Your great-grandfather wrote these words in 1945, and I added mine in 92. This book saved this family not once, but twice. It saved us in the 30s when the dust came, and it saved us in the 80s when the debt came." The boy looked at the faded handwriting, his eyes wide with wonder. "But Grandpa, the other kids at school say we should get one of those new computer-guided tractors. They say that's how you get rich." Samuel smiled, that quiet and knowing smile that had once driven Marcus Thorne to distraction. "Listen to the people who came before you, son. They paid for their knowledge with things more expensive than money. We get it for free if we are wise enough to pay attention. Most people need to be right immediately and publicly. They need validation from the crowd. But the man who controls his own supplies and refuses to dance to the bank's tune is the only one who truly controls his own fate." He pointed down toward the dark, rich soil of the North Quarter. The land doesn't need more money thrown at it. It needs more time, more biology, and less debt. The world will try to tell you that newer is always better, and that you're backward for holding on to the old ways. Let them laugh. When the next drought comes, and it always comes, you'll be the one with the green fields, while they're left with nothing but dust and empty promises. Samuel Miller passed away in 2001 at the age of 77. His funeral was the largest the county had ever seen, attended by farmers from across the Midwest who had been saved by his teachings. His son gave the eulogy, but everyone in the crowd already knew the truth. Samuel Miller had been the richest man in the county, not in dollars, but in trust, respect, and the enduring health of the soil he left behind. Today, the Miller farm is run by Michael, the fourth generation. He still uses the old notebook as his primary guide. Every spring, before the first seed touches the dirt, he sits down with his own children and reads the words that Elmer and Samuel wrote. He tells them the story of the backward man who had the courage to plant 2 crops instead of 1, to choose rocks over debt, and to trust the deep roots of the past over the shallow promises of the present. The wind still blows across DeKalb County, relentless and searching. But on the Miller land, the soil stays put. The legacy of the wrong crop is written in the deep, dark earth, a silent harvest that continues to feed the world long after the laughter has faded into the dust of history.